Hidden beneath the opulent floors of Oakhaven Manor, a terrified, heavily pregnant maid shivered in a freezing cell. Captain Graves thought he was simply disposing of an unwanted, overweight servant. He had no idea the child growing inside her belonged to his ruthless master. Hell was about to break loose. Clara Jenkins hauled the heavy commercial-grade mop bucket across the imported Italian marble of Oakhaven Manor. At 240 pounds, her knees ached with every agonizing step, and the cheap, starchy polyester of her maid's uniform chafed mercilessly against her thick thighs. It was 3 in the morning. The sprawling estate in upstate New York was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic sloshing of her mop and the harsh chemical scent of industrial Lysol that burned her nostrils. To the elite, terrifying beings who owned this estate, Clara was less than a ghost. She was a piece of the furniture, a slow, fat human who scrubbed their floors and kept her eyes glued to her scuffed orthopedic shoes. Oakhaven Manor was not just a home, it was the corporate headquarters for Aldrich Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that served as a flawless modern front for the most powerful vampire court in North America. The staff knew the rules: never make eye contact with the board members, never enter the West Wing without an escort, and never under any circumstances question the strange nocturnal hours of their employers. Clara kept her head down. She had medical bills from her late mother's stay at St. Jude's Hospital, piling up a rusted 2008 Chevy Impala that barely started, and a desperate need for the exorbitant hazard pay the Aldridge family offered. She thought her size made her invisible. She believed her soft, heavy body and flushed cheeks made her entirely unappealing to the cold, statuesque immortals who roamed the halls. She was wrong. Dominic Aldridge, the CEO of the firm, and the undisputed king of the Northern Court, had noticed her months ago. Dominic was a terrifying force of nature, a creature of flawless predatory grace, with eyes like chipped obsidian, and a reputation that made ancient vampires tremble. He was surrounded by immortal women who looked like supermodels, bony, ethereal, and impossibly cruel. Yet Dominic found himself violently exhausted by their hollow perfection. It started in the industrial kitchens late one November night. Clara had been crying over a final notice from a collection agency, stress-eating a leftover slice of cherry pie near the massive Hobart mixers. Dominic had appeared from the shadows, moving without a sound, in a bespoke Brioni suit. Clara had dropped her fork, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting to be fired or killed. Instead, the immortal king had pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and simply asked her why she was crying. He didn't look at her with disgust. He looked at her with a raw, consuming hunger that had nothing to do with feeding. To Dominic, Clara's plush, soft curves were a revelation of warmth and life. Her pulse was a steady, grounding drumbeat in his chaotic, centuries-long existence. He reached across the stainless steel prep table and wiped a tear from her plump cheek, his icy fingers leaving a trail of electric shock against her fever-warm skin. That night sparked a forbidden, highly dangerous romance. For 6 months, Clara lived a double life. By day, she was the clumsy, overweight maid who the head housekeeper scolded for moving too slowly. By night, she was sneaked into the master suites of the East Wing, wrapped in Dominic's silk sheets, her heavy body worshipped by a creature who treated her like she was the most exquisite treasure on earth. Dominic was fiercely possessive. He loved the dip of her waist, the fullness of her hips, the way she yielded to him. He whispered promises against her collarbone in the dark, swearing that once he finished a brutal political negotiation with the European factions, he would claim her publicly. He would turn her, bind her to him, and make her his queen. But Dominic had to leave. The negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, required his absolute authority, and he was scheduled to be gone for 6 excruciating weeks. Before he boarded his private Gulfstream jet, he kissed Clara fiercely in the shadows of the underground garage, pressing a heavy vintage gold signet ring into her palm. "Keep this hidden," he had murmured, his eyes glowing with predatory intensity. "I will return for you, Clara. Do not doubt me." 3 weeks after his departure, the symptoms hit. Clara had always had irregular cycles due to her weight, so a missed period wasn't an immediate red flag. But then came the dizzy spells, the violent, sudden waves of nausea that brought her to her knees in the supply closets, the strange metallic taste in her mouth, and the sudden, terrifying aversion to garlic and sunlight. Terrified, Clara drove to a 24-hour CVS off the interstate in the dead of night. She bought 3 different brands of pregnancy tests, her hands shaking as she handed over crumpled $5 bills to the bored cashier. Back in the cramped, damp bathroom of the servants' quarters, she took all 3, 2 pink lines on every single one. Clara stared at the plastic sticks, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp gasp. Human women did not survive vampire pregnancies. It was an ancient biological impossibility. The immortal genetics were too aggressive, too parasitic. But Clara's body was different. Her natural reserves, the very weight she had hated her entire life, was acting as an anchor, providing the immense energy required to incubate Dominic's heir. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach, a fierce, terrifying surge of maternal instinct washing over her. She was carrying the king's child, but Dominic was a continent away, unreachable, due to the strict security protocols of the vampire summits, and Clara was entirely alone in a house full of predators. Clara tried to hide it. She wore her oversized cardigans over her uniform, tying her apron tighter, praying the thick fabric would conceal the slight, firm rounding of her lower abdomen. She pushed through the agonizing fatigue, forcing herself to scrub baseboards and polish silver while her body worked in overdrive. The baby was demanding. It wasn't craving pickles or ice cream. Clara found herself staring obsessively at the raw steaks in the walk-in freezer, her mouth watering with an unfamiliar primal urge. But in a house full of apex predators, secrets have a scent. Captain Victor Graves was the head of Oakhaven Security, a ruthless, deeply prejudiced vampire who viewed humans as nothing more than livestock. Graves was a loyalist to the old ways, disgusted by Dominic's recent leniency toward the mortal staff. Graves had exceptional senses, even for his kind. He noticed the change in Clara's heart rate. He noticed the heavy, rich scent of elevated hormones, and most damning of all, he noticed the faint, impossibly fast secondary heartbeat echoing from the fat maid's core. Graves cornered her in the laundry room on a Tuesday evening. The massive industrial washers were spinning, masking the sound of his approach. Clara turned around, dropping a basket of towels as Graves and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Simon Miller, blocked the only exit. "You're sick, Miss Jenkins," Graves sneered, his lip curling in undisguised revulsion as he looked her up and down. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "No, not sick, parasitic. You're breeding." Clara backed away until her spine hit the cold enamel of a washing machine. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her voice trembling. She instinctively crossed her arms over her stomach. Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at her, Graves. The human livestock got herself knocked up by one of the groundskeepers. Disgusting. The master does not tolerate breeding on the premises. It attracts unwanted attention." Graves stepped into her personal space, the sheer cold radiating from his immortal body making Clara shiver. He leaned in, sniffing the air near her neck. His eyes snapped open, flashing a dangerous, violent red. He didn't smell a human infant. He smelled power. He smelled the distinct, terrifying lineage of the Aldridge bloodline. "Who did this to you?" Graves demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He grabbed her jaw, his cold fingers digging painfully into her soft cheeks. "Whose blood is growing inside you, human? No one's," Clara cried out, thrashing against his grip. "Let me go." Graves wasn't a fool. He knew Dominic had been acting strangely before his departure to Geneva. He knew the king had been spending hours unaccounted for. The realization hit the captain like a physical blow. The king of the Northern Court had soiled his lineage with a pathetic, overweight human servant. It was a disgrace. It was a political disaster that would make Oakhaven the laughingstock of the European factions if it ever got out. Graves made a split-second, treasonous decision. The child could not be allowed to exist, and Dominic could never know it had been conceived. "Take her," Graves ordered Miller, his voice like cracking ice. "To the sub-basements, the old prohibition cells." Clara screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength her 240-pound frame possessed. She kicked, she clawed, but against the supernatural strength of the royal guards, she was nothing. Miller struck her hard across the temple, Not enough to kill, but enough to send her world spiraling into darkness. When Clara awoke, the freezing dampness of the stone floor seeped into her bones. She groaned, pushing herself up onto her hands and knees. The air was thick, smelling of mildew and rusted iron. She was in a windowless stone cell, sealed by a heavy reinforced steel door. The sub-basements of Oakhaven had been abandoned for decades, located so deep underground that no human scream could ever penetrate the layers of rock and concrete above. Footsteps echoed outside the bars. Graves stood there, looking at her with absolute contempt. "You will rot down here, Jenkins," Graves said plainly. "I intercepted the letters you tried to mail to the Swiss consulate. The king will receive nothing. When he returns, I will tell him you stole from the treasury and fled into the night. He will never look for a fat, thieving maid." "He will kill you," Clara sobbed, pulling herself up to grip the freezing iron bars. "When he finds out, he will tear you apart." "He will never know," Graves smirked. "Humans need food and water to incubate a child. Down here in the dark, nature will simply take its course. Your heavy body will consume itself to feed the parasite, and then you will both quietly expire. Good riddance." The guards abandoned her to the suffocating dark. For the first few days, the psychological torment was worse than the physical. Clara wept until her throat bled, screaming for help that would never come. She huddled in the corner, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to preserve her body heat. She was terrified for her baby, terrified that Graves was right. But as the days bled into weeks, something miraculous and terrifying began to happen. The child inside her was not human, and it refused to let its mother die. Clara's body began to adapt in frightening ways. The baby, carrying the dominant predatory genes of the Vampire King, started altering her physiology to ensure their mutual survival. Clara's vision sharpened, piercing through the absolute darkness of the cell. She could see the cracks in the stone, the scurrying rats in the corners. Her hearing expanded until she could hear the water rushing through pipes floors above her, and the distant, muffled footsteps of the guards on the main level. The baby was feeding on her fat reserves, yes, but it was also flooding her system with immortal resilience. Her aches and pains vanished. The cold no longer bothered her. When a large rat ventured too close to her foot, Clara didn't scream. A sudden, terrifying instinct took over. Her hand shot out with blinding speed, snapping the creature's neck. She wept as she tore into it, her body demanding the raw protein, the iron-rich blood coating her lips. She was losing her humanity, trading it for the monstrous strength needed to protect the Aldridge heir. She sat in the dark, stroking her growing belly, her eyes faintly glowing in the pitch black. She was no longer just a maid. She was a mother, and she was going to survive until her king returned. Rain lashed furiously against the dark-tinted windows of the Sikorsky S-76 helicopter as it made a turbulent descent toward the private helipad of Oakhaven Manor. Dominic Aldridge sat in the luxurious leather cabin, his posture rigid, his mind entirely consumed by the thought of the woman waiting for him. The 6-week summit in Geneva had been a grueling gauntlet of political warfare against the European factions, a tedious game of immortal chess played in the shadows of the United Nations headquarters. He had secured the treaty, cementing his reign over the North American territories, but victory felt utterly hollow. He only wanted to return to the warm, soft embrace of Clara Jenkins. He craved the grounding weight of her plush body, the erratic, beautiful flutter of her human heartbeat, and the sheer, unadulterated honesty in her eyes. Stepping onto the wet tarmac, Dominic ignored the frantic aides trying to shield him with massive umbrellas. He strode directly toward the glass-paneled rear entrance of the manor, his bespoke Tom Ford overcoat billowing behind him like a storm cloud. His immortal senses were already extending outward, brushing against the minds of his staff, searching the sprawling estate for Clara's distinct, comforting resonance. He found nothing. Absolute, terrifying silence where her presence should have been. Captain Victor Graves stood waiting in the grand foyer, flanked by Lieutenant Simon Miller. Both men wore the impeccably tailored tactical suits favored by the Aldridge Holdings security detail, complete with concealed Glock 19 sidearms resting in Kydex holsters. Graves bowed low as Dominic crossed the threshold, the heavy oak doors sealing shut against the howling wind outside. "Welcome home, my king." Graves stated, his voice a perfect cadence of manufactured respect. "The estate is secure. The board members have been briefed on your successful negotiations." Dominic did not care about the board. his obsidian eyes locked onto Graves, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that rattled the crystal chandelier overhead. "Where is Miss Jenkins? She is not in the servants' quarters. Her presence is absent from the grounds." Graves did not flinch, though his pulse gave a microscopic, barely perceptible leap. "I deeply regret to inform you, sir, that the human maid is gone. 3 weeks ago, we discovered the petty cash safe in the West Wing had been breached. $50,000 in unmarked bills were missing. Security footage showed Miss Jenkins packing her belongings into her Chevy Impala and fleeing the property in the middle of the night. We attempted to track her, but she crossed state lines, and we assumed you would not want us wasting resources on a thieving mortal." Silence fell over the foyer. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the air pressure drop. Dominic stared at his captain of the guard, his ancient predatory mind processing the information. He slowly unbuttoned his wet overcoat, handing it to a trembling footman without breaking eye contact with Graves. "She stole from me, and she ran." Dominic repeated the words, tasting the sheer impossibility of them. "Humans are notoriously treacherous, my king," Miller added from the side, a fatal mistake. "Her kind are driven by base greed." Dominic turned on his heel and walked away, his silence far more terrifying than an outburst of rage. He bypassed his master suite and descended directly into the lower levels where the staff resided. The door to Clara's tiny, cramped room was unlocked. Dominic pushed it open. The space smelled faintly of lavender and cheap vanilla lotion, a scent that violently twisted the immortal king's dead heart. He moved methodically through the room, his eyes scanning the space, compiling a mental inventory of everything left behind. The medication. On the chipped laminate nightstand sat her albuterol asthma inhaler and a half-empty bottle of prescription thyroid medication. Clara would never survive a long drive without them. The footwear neatly tucked under the bed were her custom-fitted orthopedic work shoes. At 240 pounds, Clara required immense arch support to walk for long periods. Leaving them meant choosing agonizing pain. The mother's relic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a place Dominic knew about because Clara had whispered the secret to him in the dark, was a tarnished silver locket containing a picture of her late mother. She would have burned the house down before leaving it behind. Graves was lying. A cold, absolute fury began to crystallize in Dominic's chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing Harrison, his most trusted financial auditor, based out of a high-rise in Manhattan. "Harrison, check the routing numbers for the medical debt associated with Clara Jenkins at St. Jude's Hospital," Dominic ordered quietly. "Right away, sir. Give me 1 moment." The sharp clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoed through the receiver. "Sir, the accounts are in severe default. Multiple final collection notices have been issued in the last 3 weeks. No payments have been made." If Clara had stolen $50,000, her very first act would have been to pay off her mother's crushing medical debt. She hadn't run. She had been taken. Dominic closed his eyes, tapping into the ancient magic that flowed through his veins. Before he left for Switzerland, he had given Clara a vintage gold signet ring. That ring was not merely a piece of jewelry. It was forged in the fires of the old world, bound to the Aldridge lineage. If the wearer was in distress, the metal would act as a beacon to its master. Dominic reached out with his mind, tearing past the layers of brick mortar and drywall, searching the earth for the hum of the enchanted gold. He felt it. It was weak, muffled by tons of solid concrete and lead-lined pipes, but it was there. It wasn't driving away on an interstate. It was directly beneath his feet, straight down. Dominic moved. He didn't walk. He became a blur of kinetic violence. He reappeared in the security control room, moving so fast that the human monitors couldn't even register the shift in the air. Miller was sitting at the primary console, drinking black coffee. Dominic's hand wrapped around the lieutenant's throat, lifting the immortal soldier off the floor with effortless, terrifying power. "The prohibition cells," Dominic hissed, his fangs fully descended, his eyes burning with the fires of hell. "You put her in the dark. Why?" Miller choked, his hands clawing uselessly at Dominic's iron grip. Graves ordered it. She was breeding my king. The fat human was carrying a parasite. It was an abomination." The words struck Dominic like a physical blow. Breeding. Clara was pregnant. She was carrying his heir, an impossibility that had somehow taken root in the sanctuary of her soft, heavy body, and his guards had locked her in the freezing, lightless depths of the earth to starve. With a sickening crack, Dominic snapped Miller's neck, tossing the broken body aside like a rag doll. The king of the Northern Court was going to war. Down in the suffocating blackness of the sub-basement, Clara was no longer weeping. The weeks of isolation, starvation, and freezing temperatures had stripped away the terrified, clumsy Maid, leaving behind something entirely new. She crouched in the corner of the cell, her heavy body acting as a phenomenal biological fortress for the child growing rapidly inside her. Her plush thighs and thick waist, the very features the cruel world had constantly told her to hate, had provided the massive caloric energy required to sustain the immortal pregnancy. Without her natural weight, she would have withered and died in days. Her stomach was now taut and round, glowing faintly under her dirty, torn polyester uniform. The baby had flooded her system with vampiric venom, altering her DNA to keep its host alive. Clara's nails had elongated into sharp, blackened claws. Her eyes had adjusted to the pitch dark, glowing with a fierce, protective amber light. When the heavy steel door at the top of the stairwell suddenly exploded inward with the force of a bomb, Clara didn't cower. She bared her teeth, dropping onto all fours, ready to rip the throat out of anyone who came near her unborn child. Heavy, frantic footsteps thundered down the stone steps. Clara, the voice tore through the darkness, shattering the feral instincts that had taken over her mind. It was Dominic. The king rounded the corner, tearing the iron-barred door of the cell right off its hinges. With a horrifying screech of twisting metal, he threw the heavy grate aside and fell to his knees on the filthy stone floor. When his eyes adjusted to the dark and he saw her, the almighty ruler of the northern court, let out a ragged, heartbroken sob. "My beautiful girl," Dominic whispered, crawling toward her, completely ignoring the dirt ruining his bespoke suit. "What have they done to you?" Clara trembled, the monstrous facade breaking as she recognized the man she loved. She collapsed forward, her heavy, pregnant body falling into his arms. Dominic caught her, wrapping his coat around her shivering shoulders. He felt the firm, undeniable swell of her stomach against his chest, and he felt the impossibly fast, strong heartbeat of his child echoing from within. The impossible had happened. Her magnificent, resilient body had shielded his heir. "He said you would never look for me," Clara cried, burying her face into his neck, her voice raspy from disuse. "Graves said you would let me rot because I was just a fat maid." Dominic's hands tightened around her, his expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated sadism. "Captain Graves is going to learn exactly what happens to those who touch my queen." Dominic carried Clara out of the abyss, holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. When they reached the main floor, the entire household guard was waiting in the grand foyer, armed and uncertain. Graves stood at the front, his face pale as he realized his treason had been exposed. "My king," Graves stammered, raising his hands. "I was protecting the lineage. The human is unfit. Look at her. She is a grotesque mortal." Dominic didn't speak. He gently set Clara down on a velvet chaise lounge, ensuring she was comfortable, before turning to face his captain. Dominic moved with blinding speed. He didn't use weapons. He used his bare hands. He tore through Graves's tactical armor as if it were wet paper. The punishment was severe, a brutal, highly public execution in the center of the imported marble foyer to serve as a permanent lesson to the rest of the court. Graves was dismantled, his immortal existence ending in a display of absolute ruin that left the remaining guards dropping to their knees in sheer terror, pledging their undying loyalty to the king and his new queen. That night, in the safety of the master suite, Clara went into a premature, violent labor. The immortal child was too strong, demanding to enter the world. The Aldrich Holdings private medical team, flown in from Johns Hopkins on an emergency charter, frantically tried to stabilize her, but human medicine was useless against an ancient lineage. Clara's heart began to fail. "Turn her," Dominic ordered the chief physician, dismissing the terrified humans from the room. He climbed into the bed beside Clara, taking her trembling hand. "I am not losing you." Dominic bit into his own wrist, the crimson ichor of the king welling up thick and potent. He pressed his wrist to Clara's lips. "Drink, my love. Let the old life go." Clara swallowed the burning metallic liquid. Fire erupted in her veins, rewriting her mortality. The pain of childbirth vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of immortal power. Her heart stopped, then restarted with a thunderous, supernatural rhythm. She screamed, her spine arching, and in that moment of fiery rebirth, the heir to the northern court was born. When Clara finally opened her eyes, they were a brilliant, piercing crimson. She was no longer human, but unlike the bony, emaciated vampire women of the court, the venom had perfectly preserved her heavy, plush figure, freezing her in the glorious, abundant form that had saved her child's life. She was magnificent. Dominic placed the healthy, screaming infant boy onto Clara's chest. The baby immediately quieted, sensing his mother's immense power. Dominic leaned down, kissing Clara's forehead, then her lips worshipping the woman who had defied death itself. Oakhaven Manor would never be the same. The staff bowed deeply when Clara walked the halls, no longer a clumsy maid, but the fierce, radiant queen of the Northern Court. She ruled by Dominic's side with absolute authority, her plush curves draped in custom Oscar de la Renta gowns a living testament to the fact that true power and true beauty cannot be measured by a tailor's tape, nor can it ever be locked in the dark. Did Clara and Dominic's intense supernatural journey leave you breathless? If you loved the drama, the fierce revenge, and the ultimate triumph of the underestimated queen, hit that like button right now. Share this incredible story with your friends who crave dark romance and satisfying twists. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, high-stakes vampire lore and audio dramas. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Dominic's revenge?